Welcome back and Happy New Year to everyone out there as we get into 2022. I'm excited about this year. Not only this year, but this month. If all goes according to plan, on the 31st of this month, I will be on a plane for Eastern France, where I'm going to be bringing you guys a ton of content from the battlefields of World War I. I'm already working on the scripts and the information for the videos that I'm going to be putting together there, so I'm excited to bring those to you. But for today, I wanted to jump outside my comfort zone and really, for the first time, dive into some African history. Right about the time that I started really falling in love with history, I was about 8 years old. A mini-series came out that I think was produced in South Africa, but aired here in the United States as well. It was called Shaka Zulu, and it told the story of Shaka, who was a king in the early part of the 19th century of the Zulu in southern Africa. Now, I know very little about the Zulu, other than the later time period when they're fighting in the wars against the British at places like Isla Luanda and Rorke's Drift. Know a little bit about those time periods, but this is much, much earlier. So I'm excited to learn. I'm excited to learn from some of you who may know a little more about this, and where warranted, we'll look some things up and I'll try to add my own commentary to it. But let's use this as an opportunity to maybe learn something that many of us don't know much about. So here we go. Let's dive in. As always, the link is in the description to extra credits to their original content. Please support them if you would. Here we go.
Welcome to a new series of Extra History. Before we start, I've got two announcements. Thanks to all of you who supported us on Patreon, Extra History is now officially a weekly show. New episodes will come out every Saturday from here on. And to help us do that, we've got a new team member. Allow me to introduce Heather McNabb. She and David will be trading off every series. I'm excited. Let's get started. For the next few weeks, we'll be covering the Zulu Empire, its rise, its fall, and its famous fight against the British. We'll see a small tribe become an empire. We'll see European factions playing out the game of power on South African shores. And we'll see a late post-Napoleonic army, well-drilled and equipped with modern rifles, be beaten by an indigenous population wielding nothing more than spears and hide shields.
So, couple of things here that I think about as we get started with this. For the 1600s, into the 1700s, most of the colonial ambition of the European powers is focused in North and South America. Well, by the 1700s, they're losing a hold on those areas, especially into the early part of the 1800s, right about the time that this is going to start with. They're losing hold of those colonies in the Americas. They've also started colonizing parts of the South Pacific, but now Europe is focusing on Africa. And throughout the 1800s, as they've lost control of the Western Hemisphere, they're going to focus more on Africa and the inner parts of Africa, and that's where you're going to start to see all of these European powers gobbling up sections of Africa. The Dutch do this, and the Belgians do, well, not the Dutch, I mean the Belgians, the Germans, the British, the French, the Italians even.
But before we can do so, we need to talk about sources. There's a lot about this period that we just don't know. It's not like the Sengoku Jidai, where
Oral
it's
history.
simply hard to find translations of the more obscure records. In this case, we're dealing with a culture that didn't keep written records, so all we have to go on are scant accounts from European traders, and oral histories collected decades after the fact.
And this is true with a lot of times in history where really so much of what we know only comes from one side. Now, these oral histories are, don't discount them. Don't say, well, people are going to pass things down and it's going to be remembered wrong. This was an important part of their culture. And this was something, because they didn't have written history, it was really, really important that the oral history was done right. And there were people who were responsible for carrying these stories down. So by and large, I think the oral histories are going to be pretty accurate.
Much of what we're going to tell you, especially about the early period we're covering, are best guesses by the historians and archaeologists who have worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle of exactly what transformed the Zulus, a tribe perhaps as small as 1,500 people living in an area probably around 10 square miles, into an empire of 250,000 people, ruling over an area roughly the size of New Jersey. So, with that caveat, let's start laying out the background. Who were the Zulu people when this all began? What did life look like for them? How did they subsist? What was their government, their economy, their military? Well, they were a relatively minor tribe within the larger Bantu people, who occupied a region in what would now be the eastern part of South Africa. They had a largely pastoral economy, with wealth being measured in cattle, and the population mostly subsisting on maize and milk.
And that's not unusual. I mean, this is very much similar to what the Native Americans in North America would have been doing. And honestly, for the most part, many, as an American myself, thinking of our own history, even 150 years ago, the vast majority of Americans were subsistence farmers. They farmed what they could eat and a little bit of what they could trade for some things that they couldn't produce themselves. So it's not all that different than most of the world at that time.
They operated under a kingship, but they had very little in the way of what we would consider centralized governance. And war? Well, when our story begins, somewhere in the end of the 18th century, warfare in this region was more of a ritual affair than a destructive endeavor. Warriors would meet at a predetermined location and fling spears and insults at one another, but would rarely move in for close quarters fighting. This left the casualties very light, and it was almost unheard of for the winning side to follow up a victory by chasing down their opponents or sacking or conquering their land.
So it's important for us to think about warfare for the Zulu without the lens of what we think of warfare, where you try and destroy the enemy. This was more almost like sport to them. I mean, I don't want to use that as the exact comparison, but they weren't going in to try and eliminate an enemy and conquer them. It wasn't like that at all.
Instead, battles would result in the transfer of a small amount of territory, or some cattle. But Shaka, who will be the central figure in the early part of our story, changed all this. He changed the weapons, the tactics, and perhaps most importantly, the philosophy of war in the region. He brought in close-quarters combat, replacing the traditional long throwing spear with a shorter thrusting spear that was devastating when used in a melee. He developed a system of envelopment tactics known as the Bullhorn formation, which I'll explain in more detail later.
And that's something that we see even 60 years, 70 years later when they're fighting at places like Rorke's Drift. They're using that Bullhorn formation, which is that you move in, and then you have just imagine it like a bullhorn. The two sides then come in and envelop the flanks. It's actually a brilliant strategy, and it worked pretty well.
And he changed war from a means of settling minor disputes to an activity of slaughter and conquest. So who was Shaka? Shaka was the eldest son of the leader of the Zulu people, but he was considered illegitimate, and so wasn't named the heir to the Zulu kingdom. In fact, his name, Shaka, means intestinal beetle, which was sort of the cover story for his mother's untimely pregnancy.
Oh, jeez. So when she started having cramps and pains and things like that, they said it was an intestinal beetle, and that's what he got named. That's awesome. So not a lot is expected of him. And this is, it's interesting how often this happens. People that get overlooked, people that aren't expected to lead, end up not only leading, but transforming a nation.
Becomes kind of hilarious when you realize that we in the West often call him Shaka Zulu, and since the word Zulu actually means heaven in the Zulu language, we're basically calling him intestinal beetle heaven. So, enjoy that. Anyway, at the age of 7, because of his illegitimacy, Shaka was sent to live with his mother among the Ilangeni, a neighboring tribe. From there, he moved on to the Matetwa, the most powerful tribe in the region, where he served as a warrior first for a man named Job, and then for Job's successor, a man named Dingiswayo. Dingiswayo took notice of Shaka's unusual prowess as a close combat fighter, and when he discovered that Shaka was actually of royal blood, put him in charge of an ibuto, which you can basically think of as a regiment. And it's here that Shaka really began to refine his tactics. The traditional ibuto were armed with long throwing spears, and while they practiced the use of their weapons, they didn't do much in terms of practicing unit tactics. Generally, they would show up to the battlefield as more of a loose mob than a cohesive fighting unit.
And that makes sense because since there weren't these kind of major melee actions happening, there was no reason to train that way. And so you can already start to see how if someone can change the philosophy, change the way they fight, change the very nature of warfare itself, how that would take the neighboring tribes by surprise and how you could very quickly conquer large areas and large groups of people who aren't ready for that style of combat.
But Shaka began to experiment with this. He armed his men with the short stabbing spear and drilled them in a tactic that he called the Bullhorn. He'd split his men into 3 groups: the chest, the horns, and the loins. The chest would charge the enemy and pin them in hand-to-hand combat. Then the 2 branches of the horns, positioned to either side of the chest, would flank and envelop the pinned enemy. This whole time, the loins would sit behind the lines, acting as a rested reserve to be applied where needed. Interestingly, it's been said that Shaka would have these men sit with their backs to the fighting so they wouldn't become panicked or charge overeagerly before he needed them. The brilliance of this system was that it was simple. Without much battlefield coordination, every man knew what he was supposed to do.
Yeah, you're not changing the tactics every time you fight. It's the same strategy. And why does that work? It works because nobody else knows how to fight like this. You know, once you get into a situation where other people understand your tactics, it's going to be a different story. But at least early on, that's not going to happen here. And so everybody knows their role. It's three things. You know, you're either this part, you're this part, or you're this part. And everybody knows their role. Everybody knows their job. The other side isn't ready for it. It's brilliant in its simplicity.
If you're in the chest, you charge. If you're in the horns, you get around their flank. The system's simplicity meant that it could be applied in chaotic conditions without much of the signaling that was required by modern armies. With these deadly new weapons and tactics, Shaka became a force to be reckoned with.
And why does the close combat thing work? Because once everybody on the other side throws their spears, what do? They're not trained in close combat fighting. They're not used to having to do that. And so now you've got them right where you want them. You withstand that initial kind of missile combat in the first few minutes, and then you've got them.
And when his father died, he decided it was time to take his own. Shaka's half-brother, the legitimate heir, took the Zulu throne, but with the help of Dingiswayo, Shaka quickly had him assassinated, and simply moved in to take over the place. Dingiswayo was still the chief of the Zulus, so Shaka continued to serve him, but only a year later, Dingiswayo was killed by a man named Zwide, the ruler of the Ndwandwe, one of the most powerful tribes in the region. Shaka vowed vengeance for his leader's death, and stepped in to fill the void Dingiswayo had left behind, bringing the Matetwa, and with them many of the other local tribes, under his control.
So now you've got an opportunity, and you've got your casus belli, right? You've got your reason to go to war. This guy killed our leader. I will now step in reluctantly into try and fill his shoes, but to get revenge. And so it's the perfect storm. And now he can train his people. Even though they're small, there's not many of them. Here's an opportunity.
Shaka's vengeance and the war he was about to bring would lead to a period of unparalleled chaos and devastation. In Zulu, they call it the Mefakane. In English, we simply call it the crushing. But before we delve into the crushing, we should talk about why war here became genocide, and why the region was so primed to explode at the first signs of strife. A lot of it has to do with European influence. Not because Europeans tried to cause it, in fact there were many Europeans who tried to help, but given how radically different, how wealthy, how technologically separated the Europeans were from the local population, their mere presence dramatically destabilized the region. As European trade increased, new crops were introduced, which led to a population increase, which in turn led to greater competition for land. Meanwhile, European ships would trade for cattle to resupply their food stores, which made cattle even more valuable and led to an increase in raiding. At the same time...
And remember, cattle is your status symbol. It's your wealth. It is how you measure who the inn people are. And so as the Europeans are bringing more cattle or buying the cattle, they're making it more valuable. And so now there's an even greater desire to fight over the available cattle. And so he's right. They've brought, even though they're not trying to invade and conquer, their presence is a destabilizing influence, just like it was in North America.
European traders also came looking for ivory, and to get ivory, you have to take down elephants, which requires a large degree of coordination from a group of people, which some have said led to the more coordinated and far more deadly tactics that Shaka was able to implement. To add to all of this, a drought caused the more water-hungry European crops to fail, which led to a famine. So the area, Natal, was already primed for disaster.
So you've brought in crops that aren't typically used in this region. People start depending on them, and now they fail because they were never really intended for that region. Oh, boy.
Join us next week as we explore Shaka's quest for vengeance, see his descent into madness, and witness the horrors of the crushing.
Interesting. I'm excited to learn more. Let me know your thoughts about all this stuff. Like I said, this is an area I don't know a lot about. I'm trying to make observations, and I'm trying to kind of learn in real time here and kind of think through this stuff out loud. So I'm curious to learn more and kind of see where this goes. I know how Shaka's story ends up specifically, but I don't know much more about the process from point A to point B. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Please hit that like button if you're new to the channel. I would love to have your subscription if you feel I've earned it. Check out some of my original content as well. I hope you enjoy it. Thanks.